The dog's growl shattered the silence. Samuel froze, heart pounding in his chest as Echo's amber eyes fixed on the darkening woods ahead. A chill ran down his spine. There was nothing here, no one, just an empty town. Yet the dog's warning was clear, something was lurking. Easy boy, Samuel muttered, but Echo wouldn't budge. The air felt thick, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then just as quickly, Echo went still, and the wind picked up, carrying a sound that shouldn't have been there. A whisper. They're coming. What had Echo heard that Samuel hadn't? Samuel's hand instinctively gripped the rifle at his side, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't something a weapon could solve. Echo's ears twitched, his body tense, as if bracing for something unseen. The dog's gaze never wavered from the trees where shadows twisted unnaturally in the fading light. "You're overreacting," Samuel muttered under his breath, though the words felt hollow even to him. The small town they'd come to for peace hadn't shown any signs of trouble yet. Another growl rumbled deep in Echo's chest, louder now, as if the animal had no intention of leaving without answers. The wind shifted, and with it the faintest scent of something. Off. Not the usual earthy smell of the woods, but something metallic, something wrong. Samuel's pulse quickened. He was about to turn and walk away when Echo snapped his head toward the forest's edge. The last thing Samuel saw before the dog lunged forward was a fleeting shadow, and then nothing. What had Echo seen that Samuel hadn't? The truck's tires rattled against the uneven dirt road, sending occasional bursts of dust into the air. Samuel's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles pale from the pressure. The endless stretch of barren landscape outside the windshield felt almost suffocating. He wasn't sure whether it was the oppressive quiet of the road or the weight of his own thoughts that made him feel so trapped. Both had their way of wearing him down. His eyes flicked to Echo, the dog sitting upright beside him as always. The animal's head was cocked to one side, ears alert, nose pressed against the window, sniffing the faint smell of pine and something older, something heavier. They had been on the road for days, crossing state lines and leaving the city behind. The distant echo of helicopters, the hum of city streets, and the haunting sounds of distant gunfire were now only memories. Here, the only sound was the rhythmic hum of the truck's engine, and the occasional growl of the dog signaling something unspoken. He wasn't sure what he'd expected from this new chapter, but he had hoped for peace. A quiet life where the air didn't feel so thick, where he wasn't constantly waiting for something to go wrong. The farther they drove, the more that hope seemed like a distant dream. Echo had been his constant companion even before the war, when Samuel was a different man, one not shaped by blood and memory. The dog had saved his life more times than he cared to count, and it wasn't just in the obvious ways. Echo had always known how to find the right moment to nudge Samuel when his mind threatened to swallow him whole. In the quietest of times, the dog would bring him back from the brink, his presence, a steady reminder that there was something worth holding on to, and that something, at least for Samuel, had been Echo. The dog had never asked for anything, never judged, never faltered, and Samuel had never had a better friend. But now, as the town came into view, that unshakable bond was beginning to feel like a tether that might bind him to something darker. They passed a few old barns, their walls leaning with the weight of age, and some scattered homes, none of which seemed to have much life in them. Samuel didn't know what he expected when he left the city, but it certainly wasn't this ghost of a place that felt as if it were barely hanging on. The town was quiet. Too quiet. No children running through the streets, no elderly folks sitting on porches, no cars in driveways. Just an eerie stillness that hung in the air like a shroud. As they reached the center of town, Echo's body tensed. The dog's posture stiffened, and he let out a low growl that vibrated through the truck's metal frame. Samuel instinctively glanced at the rearview mirror, then out the side window, but there was nothing in sight. No movement, no figures standing in the streets. "Easy, boy," Samuel murmured, his voice strained in the unnatural stillness. But Echo wasn't listening. The dog's ears remained erect, his eyes locked ahead, scanning the horizon. Samuel pulled the truck to a stop at the edge of town near the small house he'd rented for the next few months. It wasn't much, just a two-story structure with a crumbling porch peeling paint and a yard that looked like it hadn't seen care in years. It was perfect, peaceful, quiet, exactly what he had hoped for. But as he stepped out of the truck, Samuel couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had begun to settle in his chest. The wind had picked up, stirring the overgrown grass around the yard, but it didn't bring the comforting scent of fresh air that Samuel was used to. There was something else mixed into it, something faintly metallic, almost sour. It lingered at the back of his throat, and he coughed to push it away. Echo hopped out of the truck beside him, but instead of trotting to the front door like usual, the dog stayed rooted to the ground, his eyes scanning the trees that bordered the property. Samuel followed his gaze but saw nothing, just the rustling of leaves in the growing dusk, the shadows lengthening across the yard. He knew better than to ignore Echo's instincts, but the dog had been on edge ever since they left the city. Maybe the journey was getting to him. He reached into the bed of the truck and grabbed his pack, then turned back to the house, but Echo's growl stopped him cold. It wasn't the low, calm sound he usually made when something caught his attention. This was different, a deep, rumbling growl, one that vibrated through the ground beneath them. Samuel turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat, but the yard was still empty. The trees swayed in the wind, and the night birds called faintly from the distance. But something felt wrong. Samuel put down his pack and crouched next to Echo, his hand resting on the dog's back. The animal's muscles were tight, his fur standing on end, and his tail was held rigid, straight as a line. Samuel could feel the energy in the air, crackling an electric tension that seemed to fill every inch of space around them. "Shh," Samuel whispered softly. "It's okay, boy. You're just tired. We'll get settled in and everything will be fine." But Echo didn't seem convinced. He whined softly, his eyes darting between the house and the line of trees, and then back to Samuel. The dog wasn't just reacting to the house or the unfamiliar scent, he was responding to something else. Something out there. With a sigh, Samuel stood up, brushing the dirt off his pants. "We're here now. Let's get inside, okay?" he said, trying to keep his voice light, but even to his own ears it sounded hollow. The unease wasn't going away, and neither was Echo's strange behavior. Inside the house, things felt just as empty. There were boxes scattered haphazardly around the rooms, some filled with half-unpacked items, others untouched. The house was old, with creaky floors and faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. It was colder inside than Samuel had expected, and the air carried a musty scent of neglect. Echo entered behind him, but didn't settle, instead pacing from room to room, his paws clicking sharply against the hardwood floors. The dog seemed determined to check every corner, every crevice, his eyes scanning every shadow as if searching for something. "Hey, calm down," Samuel muttered, rubbing his face with both hands. But Echo didn't calm. The dog's eyes locked on the hallway, and his growl returned soft but growing in intensity. Samuel walked over and knelt beside him. "What is it, boy? What do you hear?" Echo's tail stiffened and his ears flicked forward. Samuel followed his gaze down the hallway, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The house was empty, just like it had been when they first arrived. Still, the silence of it all, the heavy stillness seemed to press down on him, a weight that refused to lift. The house creaked once again, this time from above, as though something heavy had shifted upstairs. "What the hell?" Samuel muttered, his heart beginning to race. He stood quickly, reaching for the rifle that rested against the wall by the door. He didn't know why, but his instincts were on edge. Every sound, every creak seemed louder now, the air thick with an unseen pressure that made it hard to breathe. Echo was still at his side, moving closer, as though urging him forward. The dog's hackles were raised, and Samuel followed him without question. The dog led him toward the stairs. Samuel hesitated for only a moment before he gripped the railing and slowly ascended. The silence up here was different, as if it were waiting for something. Echo stepped lightly behind him, and as Samuel reached the top of the stairs, he paused, scanning the dark hallway. The house's old beams groaned with the wind outside. There was no reason for him to feel this way. It was just an old house, abandoned for years. But everything about this place was too quiet, too still. He reached the first room, the door creaking open with a loud groan. It was small, and the air was thick with dust. A single window on the far wall let in a faint sliver of light from the fading sunset, casting long shadows across the floor. But then he saw it. In the corner of the room, a figure. At first Samuel thought it was just the reflection of something, but then the figure moved, a shadow. Echo's growl rose in his throat, and Samuel felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Whatever it wasn't supposed to be here. The dog had known it before he did. With a deep breath, Samuel stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. Whatever was coming, whatever had been lurking in the town in the shadows of this house, he wasn't going to wait for it to find him. The room seemed darker now, the shadows crawling across the floor as if they were alive. Samuel stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the corner where the shadow had shifted, lingering just beyond the reach of the dim light spilling from the window. The air around him was thick, heavy, with something that wasn't quite right. Echo's growl had turned into a low, sustained rumble, vibrating through the floorboards beneath their feet, his body rigid tense, ready for whatever might come next. Samuel swallowed his mouth dry. He knew the dog's instincts better than anyone. They had saved him countless times before. But this was different. There was an energy in the room, a pressure that hung in the air like a storm, and it seemed to grow thicker with every breath. Samuel's heart hammered in his chest, a rapid rhythm that echoed in his ears, drowning out everything else. He couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was watching, waiting, ready to pounce. "Easy boy," Samuel whispered, but even as he spoke, the words they felt hollow. The tension was too thick to cut through with simple reassurance. The silence that had fallen over the house was oppressive, the kind of quiet that only existed in places that had seen things long buried, long forgotten. The last few days had been difficult for Samuel. He had hoped that this place, this quiet little town tucked away in the mountains, would offer him the solitude he needed, the space to breathe, to forget, to heal. But so far, the only thing he had found was emptiness, a quiet that didn't bring peace but an eerie sort of discomfort. And now, standing in this room with the dog growling low and unrelenting, Samuel realized that this place wasn't going to be his escape after all. Echo's growl deepened, the sound reverberating through the room like a warning shot. The dog's eyes remained locked on the corner, unwavering, his tail stiffened, his muscles taut as if ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. Samuel's breath hitched in his throat. Something had disturbed the dog. Something was hiding in that corner, something unseen, something waiting. Samuel glanced at the door, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle slung across his back. There was no real reason to think he needed it. The town was small, sleepy, harmless enough. No signs of trouble. But Echo's behavior made Samuel hesitate. The dog had always been sensitive, aware of things that Samuel couldn't perceive: the distant rumble of an approaching storm, the scent of an unfamiliar animal in the air, the sound of danger lurking in the distance. But this was different. There was an urgency to it now, a need that Samuel couldn't ignore. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. But Echo didn't answer. He didn't need to. The dog's body language said it all. The way he stood, his fur bristling along his spine, the way his ears flicked back and forth, listening for something just beyond the realm of human perception. It was almost as if the house itself were alive, breathing, waiting for something. Samuel's eyes flicked to the corner again, where the shadows seemed to move to pulse with something more than just the fading light of dusk. His heartbeat quickened. Was it his imagination, or was there something truly hiding in that corner? The silence felt too thick, too complete. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. The very air in the room seemed to hold its breath, as if it too was waiting for something to break the stillness. Echo took a slow, deliberate step forward, his paws making barely a sound against the old wooden floor. Samuel remained where he was rooted in place, though his legs felt heavy like lead. His chest tightened, and he realized that despite himself, he was holding his breath. The dog growled again, louder this time, a low, threatening rumble that vibrated through the room. It was clear now that Echo wasn't going to back down. There was something there, something out of place. Samuel's mind raced through all the possibilities. Was it an animal, a rodent, or something worse? Echo's growl continued, but now it was accompanied by a whine, a high-pitched, almost desperate sound that Samuel had never heard from the dog before. It was as if Echo was warning him not just about the shadow, but about something more dangerous, something that Samuel wasn't prepared for. The room felt colder now, the air growing thicker with each passing second. Samuel reached for the rifle, his hand trembling as he gripped the cold metal. But his fingers seemed to hesitate, as if they knew something he didn't, that the weapon in his hand would offer no protection against what was about to unfold. The dog's body went rigid, and Samuel could see the muscles in Echo's neck and shoulders, flexing his entire being focused on the corner of the room. Without warning, Echo lunged his powerful body, moving in a blur of fur and speed. Samuel barely had time to react as the dog bolted for the corner claws, scraping against the floorboards, as he bounded forward with the determination of a creature that had just found its prey. The sound of Echo's sudden movement echoed through the room, sharp and startling in the otherwise quiet house. "Echo!" Samuel shouted, but it was too late. The dog was already digging at the floor, his paws clawing at the wooden boards as if trying to tear through the very foundation of the house. Samuel rushed forward, but even as he did, he could feel the air growing colder, the room growing darker, as though something were seeping out from the corners, filling the space around them with a palpable sense of dread. Echo's growls became more frantic, more desperate, as his claws scraped against the floor, splintering the boards beneath him. Samuel stood frozen for a moment, watching the dog tear at the floor, his chest tightening with fear. He could feel the darkness in the room, the heaviness of the air pressing against him. It was as if something from the depths of the earth itself was about to rise up. The floorboards cracked loudly, splintering with a sharp, sickening sound as one of them gave way beneath the dog's paws. The moment the board splintered, there was a distinct scraping noise, like something moving not beneath the floor but within it. A low, wet scraping sound followed, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from the dark space beneath the floorboards. Samuel's heart skipped a beat, his blood turning cold. Something was down there. Something was trying to get out. Echo's barking reached a fever pitch, now a mixture of warning and aggression. his teeth bared as he scratched desperately at the floor, the noise growing louder and more frantic with each passing second. The room seemed to close in around Samuel, the air thick with an energy he couldn't explain. He could hear his own breath coming fast and shallow, his chest tight with anxiety. And then in the middle of the chaos, it stopped. The scraping ceased. The growling died down. Echo paused, his body still, and alert, his ears flat against his skull. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the dog, every nerve in his body screaming at him to move, to do something, to run. But he couldn't move. His feet were glued to the spot. That's when he heard it. A soft, shuffling sound, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder, closer. It was as if something was moving just beneath the floor, something that had been waiting for them to make a move. Samuel's eyes darted toward the corner where the noise was coming from, his hand tightening around the rifle. But there was nothing there, nothing visible, nothing that made sense. And then he heard it again. A faint whisper so soft it could have been the wind, but somehow he knew it wasn't. "They know you're here." The words weren't clear, not entirely, but Samuel felt their weight. They hung in the air like a bad omen, a warning of something worse. Echo's growl rose again, sharp and high, but now there was a note of uncertainty in it, as though the dog himself wasn't sure what to make of what was about to happen. Samuel's pulse quickened and his grip on the rifle tightened. The silence between the growls seemed endless, and he knew deep in his gut that something was coming. Something out of sight, something he couldn't explain. But whatever it was tied to this place. To the house, to the land they were standing on. And it had been waiting for them, waiting for him. The silence in the room was deafening now. Echo stood frozen, his body tense as a bowstring, his eyes locked on the floor, waiting. Samuel's heart hammered in his chest, the pulse in his ears growing louder, drowning out everything else. The rifle felt heavy in his hands, and yet it offered him no comfort. There was something about this house, something ancient and buried deep beneath its floors, that made him feel as if he were standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between reality and something else, something he could not yet comprehend. The air was thick with dread, the oppressive weight of the unknown pressing in on him. It was no longer just the house that felt wrong. Everything about this town, about the way the wind blew through the trees outside, the way the shadows shifted at the edges of his vision, felt like it was part of a much larger story, a story that had begun long before he had ever arrived. And that thought sent a chill down his spine. Echo's growl broke the silence once more, louder this time, more insistent. The dog's stance was that of a creature who had seen too much, who had been forced to witness horrors that no living being should ever endure. Samuel had been with Echo through every battle, every war, every storm, but this was something different, something beyond even their understanding. Samuel took a slow, steadying breath. He had to move. He couldn't stay frozen here forever, waiting for something he didn't understand. And yet with each step he took forward, he felt the house shift like it was adjusting to his presence, pushing him into the unknown. The oppressive weight of the house seemed to follow him as though it were alive, aware of his every move. Taking one final look at the shattered floorboards where Echo had been digging, Samuel stepped cautiously toward the open space beneath them, the darkness below, inviting and terrifying all at once. Echo stepped forward too, the dog's body vibrating with a low hum of warning. "Stay close, boy," Samuel muttered, his voice, strained, barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. Echo's eyes flicked to him for a moment, before returning to the darkness below. It was as though the dog knew in some primal way that Samuel wasn't ready for what was coming, that the truth of this house was something that couldn't be explained. He crouched down the splintered floorboards, creaking under his weight as he peered into the space beneath. The air in the room grew colder still, and Samuel shuddered involuntarily. There was something here, something hiding just beneath the surface. Suddenly a noise, not the sound of scratching this time, but a voice faint and distant. A whisper carried on the wind, or perhaps through the walls. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. "Leave this place." The words weren't clear, but the message was unmistakable. The house, or whatever lived inside it, didn't want him here. It didn't want anyone here. And yet in some strange way, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that he had been called here, as though this place had been waiting for him for years. Echo's growl shifted again, this time higher pitched, almost urgent. The dog moved closer, brushing against Samuel's side, as though offering him some measure of comfort, though it was clear that even Echo could sense the danger that lurked ahead. "All right, boy," Samuel muttered, forcing himself to stand. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do next, but one thing was clear: he couldn't leave without finding out what had happened here. The unease in his chest, the feeling of being watched, it wouldn't go away until he understood what had set Echo on edge, what had made this house its home for so many years. As he turned to move back toward the doorway, a sudden thought flashed in his mind, a memory, one that he hadn't thought about in years. His fingers clenched tightly around the rifle as the memory unfolded before him, a story from his past, one buried deep beneath layers of pain and loss. The sounds of gunfire echoed in his ears, the sharp cracks of bullets slicing through the air, and the deafening roar of helicopters overhead. Samuel's breath was shallow, his mind focused on the task at hand, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. His squad had been pinned down in the jungle for days, the enemy closing in from every direction. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with humidity, and the tension between the men was palpable. Every second felt like an eternity. Echo had been with him through it all. The dog was younger, then full of energy, but still just as loyal. He had been trained to detect the smallest movement, the faintest sound, to alert Samuel to danger before it arrived. Samuel had trusted Echo with his life more times than he could count, and the dog had never let him down. But that day had been different. They were trapped. The enemy had them surrounded, and there was no way out. Samuel could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The war had already taken so much from him, but this was a different kind of pressure. It was suffocating, more oppressive than any battle he had ever fought. And he knew deep in his gut that this mission would be his last. Echo had sensed it before anyone else. The dog had been agitated, his ears flicking nervously, his tail stiff with tension. He paced in circles, his eyes darting to the tree line, as though he knew something was coming. Samuel had tried to calm him, but it was no use. Echo's instincts were honed beyond anything Samuel could understand. The enemy attacked in waves, their footsteps muffled by the thick brush, but Echo had been ready. The dog had taken the first blow, leaping forward, with a ferocity that Samuel had never seen before, his body tearing into the enemy soldiers with a strength fueled by desperation. But as much as Echo had fought, he couldn't stop the barrage that followed. Samuel had watched in horror as the dog was struck down, his body collapsing in a heap, the blood staining the jungle floor. And that's when Samuel knew. He knew that war, this endless cycle of violence and pain, had taken more from him than he could bear. It had taken his comrades, his peace, and now it had almost taken Echo. The memories flooded back, a torrent of regret and anger. He had been helpless. Helpless to save the dog. Helpless to stop the bloodshed. The war had been a battlefield of broken promises, of things lost and never recovered. But Echo had survived. He had always survived. Samuel's grip tightened on the rifle, his fingers slipping slightly from the sweat that had gathered in his palms. The memories crashed over him, unrelenting, dragging him back to that moment in the jungle. He had left the war behind, or so he thought. But now here in this house with Echo by his side, he realized that the past never really stayed buried. It followed him, whispered to him in the quietest moments, and now it had found him again. The dog's bark snapped him out of his reverie. He turned toward Echo, whose eyes were fixed on the darkened space beneath the floor, his growl growing louder, more insistent. Samuel knew that this house, this cursed place, was not just a random location. It had been waiting for him to come back to face whatever it was that had been buried here all these years. But why? Why him? And what had Echo sensed that Samuel hadn't yet discovered? The mystery of the house, the town, and his past, all swirled together in a knot of uncertainty and fear. With one final glance toward the darkness below, Samuel straightened, his jaw set. Whatever waited for him in the depths of this house, whatever had called him here, he would face it. Echo was at his side. Together they had always fought their battles. And this one would be no different. The walls of the house seemed to close in on Samuel as he made his way deeper into the darkness beneath the floor. Echo was now standing motionless, his body tense, muscles coiled as if ready to spring into action at any moment. Samuel's breath came in, shallow bursts, his mind still reeling from the flashbacks of war, the sense of dread that had grown heavier with each passing moment. He hadn't expected it to feel like this, like a sickening pull that dragged him back to the very core of his nightmares. The house felt alive, but not in a comforting way. The creaking of the floorboards, the way the wind howled just beyond the windows, it all seemed too deliberate, too unnatural. Whatever had been hidden here, whatever was buried beneath the floorboards, was far worse than anything Samuel could have imagined. And it was still waiting. He crouched down beside the gaping hole in the floor where the boards had splintered, revealing a blackened void beneath the house. Echo's growl had softened, now turning into a quiet whimper, almost as if the dog were trying to hold his own fear at bay. Samuel could see the dog's pupils dilated, his breath coming in short, nervous bursts. The dog's usual, calm, protective demeanor had been replaced by an animalistic tension, the type of fear only found in the presence of something ancient, something he didn't understand. Samuel swallowed hard, pushing his own fear down. He wasn't about to let the house get the better of him. Not now. Not when he was so close to uncovering whatever had been lurking here. Taking a deep breath, he reached down into the hole. The air from below felt cold, biting, and it sent a shiver down his spine as he hesitated for just a moment. Whatever lay beneath was not of this world. That much he could feel, but there was no turning back. He had to know. He had to finish what he had started. With one last look at Echo, Samuel plunged his hand into the dark space, pulling up a handful of dirt twigs and something cold. At first, it felt like a rock, something solid and immovable. But as he pulled it into the dim light of the room, he realized it wasn't a rock. It was a bone. A human bone. Samuel recoiled, his heart racing. The bone was weathered, its edges smoothed by years of decay, but it was unmistakable. There was no doubt about it. Someone had been buried here beneath the floor of this house, left to rot in secrecy. But why? And who? Echo's growl intensified, sharp and piercing, but it wasn't directed at the hole in the floor anymore. No, it was focused somewhere else, toward the back of the room, where the shadows seemed to shift once more. Samuel's pulse quickened. Something was moving, something that didn't belong in this house, and it wasn't hiding beneath the floor anymore. Echo, Samuel whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. Stay close. The dog's hackles stood on end, but he didn't move toward Samuel. Instead, he backed up, his body tense and trembling. Samuel turned slowly, his heart hammering in his chest as he glanced around the room. At first there was nothing, just the familiar shadows, the dim light from the window casting long, eerie shapes across the walls. But then the air grew colder, colder than it had been before, and there in the corner something shifted. A shape barely perceptible in the gloom, a flicker of movement. Samuel's hand tightened around the rifle. His heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just an ordinary haunting. This was something else. Something that had been waiting, watching. The shadows seemed to twist and writhe, the air growing thicker, heavier. Echo barked once sharply, but it wasn't a bark of aggression. It was a bark of warning and fear. And then from the darkness, a figure stepped forward. It wasn't fully formed at first. It seemed to shimmer, flickering in and out of sight, like an afterimage burned into Samuel's retinas. A silhouette, tall and thin, dressed in tattered clothing, its face obscured by darkness. But Samuel could make out one detail, its eyes. Eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light, like two embers burning deep within the shadows. "Who are you?" Samuel demanded, his voice cracking in disbelief. His body was rigid, frozen in place, though every instinct told him to run. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there watching him. Echo's low growl escalated into something more primal, a bark that shook the air with the force of it. But the figure didn't flinch. It didn't even acknowledge the dog. Samuel's mind raced. Was this a ghost, an apparition? Had the war, the isolation, the house itself finally pushed him to the edge of madness? Was he hallucinating? It didn't feel like a hallucination. The cold in the air was real, the tension thick in his chest was real. And the fear. The fear in Echo's eyes was as real as anything Samuel had ever felt. Suddenly the figure took a step forward, and it was as if the air itself shifted. The shadows seemed to bend around it, pulling it closer into focus. The figure's features began to sharpen, revealing an emaciated face, gaunt and pale, the skin stretched tightly over the bones. The eyes were no longer just glowing embers. They were dark, hollow pits, filled with an ancient malice that seemed to pierce straight through Samuel's soul. The room felt like it was closing in. Samuel could barely breathe, the weight of the presence in the room crushing him. The figure's lips twisted into a thin, cruel smile, and then in a voice that was not quite a whisper but not quite a shout, it spoke, "You shouldn't have come here." The words sent a shock through Samuel's body. He took a step back, his heart pounding, but his legs felt like lead. The figure's gaze never wavered, its presence growing stronger with each passing second. Echo barked again, but this time Samuel didn't feel the same sense of urgency in the dog's voice. It was as though the dog knew that there was nothing they could do to stop this, nothing they could do to stop what was coming. The figure took another step forward, and the ground beneath them seemed to shift. Samuel's breath caught in his throat as the floor groaned underfoot, the walls of the house, creaking with an unnatural sound. The wind outside, which had been howling through the trees, now seemed to reverberate inside the house, as well rattling the windows. And then in a sudden burst of motion, the figure lunged forward. The figure lunged, and the world seemed to snap into chaos. Echo's bark shattered the air, and in an instant, the dog was charging, his body a blur of movement as he leaped toward the shadowy form that had emerged from the corner. Samuel's heart skipped a beat as his body reacted before his mind could catch up. His fingers tightened around the rifle, but it felt clumsy and his hands useless. Echo's howl filled the room, a frantic cry of warning, but there was no time to process. The figure moved with unnatural speed, sidestepping Echo with a fluidity that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The dog's teeth snapped together with a sharp crack, but the figure was already gone, vanishing into the darkness as if it had never been there in the first place. Samuel's breath came in short, desperate gasps, his pulse thundering in his ears. He scanned the room frantically, but the figure was gone. The shadows were still like the calm before the storm, but the air was thick with an oppressive silence that screamed of danger. Echo Samuel shouted, his voice rough with panic. The dog was no longer at his side. Samuel's heart clenched. He stumbled forward, his legs unsteady beneath him as he hurried toward the corner of the room where Echo had last been. The dog was there, but not in the way Samuel had expected. Echo was backed into the corner, his body low to the ground, eyes wide with fear. His growl was soft, almost hesitant, as he stared at the spot where the figure had disappeared, waiting for it to reappear. The dog's breath was quick and shallow, his muscles coiled, ready to spring at a moment's notice. Samuel's chest tightened as he knelt beside the dog, his hand shaking as he placed it on Echo's fur. The dog flinched at his touch but didn't pull away. Echo wasn't just scared, he was terrified. Samuel had never seen the dog so shaken. Echo, who had faced gunfire and explosions without flinching, was now cowering before an unseen force, something neither of them could explain. The fear in Echo's eyes was the worst part. It wasn't just a normal primal fear. It was the kind of fear that Samuel had seen in the eyes of soldiers moments before a battle. The fear of the unknown, the dread of something far worse than death. The figure had left its mark not just on the house, but on them both. Easy boy Samuel muttered, his voice hoarse. He didn't know what to say to calm Echo down, didn't know what to do to protect them both. For the first time in a long time, he felt helpless. The house felt even colder now, the air thick with something malevolent that seemed to seep into his very bones. Samuel's thoughts spun in a chaotic whirlpool. His mind refused to settle, his past and present colliding with violent force, leaving him disoriented. The thing in the house, whatever it was, wasn't just a ghost. It wasn't just some figment of his imagination. It was real, and it had been waiting for them, waiting for him. He had come here looking for peace, a place to escape his memories, to bury the war and the haunting images of his past. But instead, the past had found him just as it always did. The war hadn't ended for him. It had followed him. The horrors, the fear, the pain, they were still with him, lurking just beneath the surface. He had hoped that the quiet of the house would silence the war's echoes. But now it seemed that the house itself was echoing with something far darker, something that had been alive long before Samuel had ever set foot here. As he looked at Echo, his mind flashed back to the days after the war, the long nights spent in the dark, the weight of his survival gnawing at his soul. He had tried to push it all down, tried to forget the blood, the death, the things he had done. But the war had a way of clawing its way to the surface, forcing him to confront it when he least expected it. Echo had been there through all of it, through the darkest nights, through the blood-soaked battlefields, through the nightmares. But even the dog, it seemed, had its limits. Now, as they faced this unknown force together, Samuel realized that the war wasn't over. It had never truly ended. It was here in this house in the darkness that pressed in on them both. His breath caught in his throat as a realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The house had been waiting for him. Echo had sensed it first. The dog's instincts had led them here. But it wasn't just the house or the figure that had been waiting. It was the memories, the ghosts of the past that Samuel had tried so desperately to leave behind. They had followed him. And now in this place, they had all come together, the house, the war, the figure, and the secrets buried beneath the floorboards. Samuel closed his eyes, swallowing hard. The guilt, the grief, the endless cycle of trying to escape the past had brought him to this point. But the truth was that there was no escape. Not from the house, not from the past. And certainly not from the man he had become because of it. Echo whimpered softly, nudging Samuel's hand as if trying to pull him out of his spiraling thoughts. Samuel opened his eyes and looked at the dog, who was now staring at him with an almost pleading expression. Echo had been through so much. He had been Samuel's constant, his protector, his lifeline, through every battle. And now, as the dog's eyes locked onto his, Samuel realized that he wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was fighting for Echo too. With a steadying breath, Samuel pushed himself to his feet, his resolve hardening like steel. He couldn't let the past win. He couldn't let the house, or whatever was lurking here, break him. He had come this far. He wasn't going to give up now. "Come on, boy," he whispered, the words more for himself than for the dog. "We're getting out of here. Together." He reached out gently, pulling Echo to his feet. The dog hesitated for a moment, but then, sensing his owner's determination, moved alongside him, his tail stiff but his posture a little less tense. They weren't going to give in. They would face whatever haunted this place head-on. Together, they would confront the darkness that had been waiting for them. The house felt as if it were alive, breathing in the dark with them. The air had grown thick, almost solid, like they were moving through a veil, with each step carrying the weight of an unspoken truth. Samuel could feel the pulse of something ancient in the very walls, like a heartbeat echoing in the stillness. Echo was by his side, his body tense but no longer as frantic. The dog's instincts had calmed, but Samuel knew that whatever they were about to face, they would face it together. As they moved through the house, the shadows seemed to twist around them. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside felt amplified, like the house itself was watching, waiting for their next move. Samuel's heart was pounding in his chest, and his fingers were wrapped tightly around the rifle. He wasn't sure what good it would do against whatever haunted this place, but it was all he had left. He was no longer fighting for survival. He was fighting for closure, for the redemption he'd never thought possible. The footsteps of Echo, though soft, were louder than ever, as if they were resonating through the very foundation of the house. Samuel could hear the dog's breathing beside him, slow but steady, a reassurance in the midst of his own growing dread. "Stay close," Samuel muttered, his voice barely more than a breath. He didn't know who he was, warning himself or Echo. The dog was always close, always alert, but now there was something different in the air. It wasn't just the presence of the figure that haunted them, it was the history of the house, the secrets that had been buried here for decades. The house wasn't just haunted by spirits. It was haunted by guilt, by fear, by memories of things long buried but never forgotten. As they reached the far end of the hallway, the room at the end caught Samuel's eye. It was the one room they hadn't entered yet, the one room that had always seemed to be waiting for them. The door was ajar, the faintest sliver of light spilling from within. The shadows in the room beyond seemed to beckon as though the very air was drawing them in. "Here we go," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible. He motioned for Echo to stay behind him, and with a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The room beyond was smaller than the others, its walls lined with old bookshelves that reached all the way to the ceiling. The smell of dust and decay filled the air, thick and musty. A single window let in the faintest light from the moon, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. In the center of the room stood an old desk, its surface covered in yellowed papers and dried ink. But it wasn't the desk that caught Samuel's attention. It was the figure standing in the far corner. The figure from before. It stood perfectly still, watching them, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was solid, its features sharp, and defined a man, or something that had once been a man. The face was gaunt, stretched too tight over its skull with hollow eyes that burned like embers in the darkness. Its mouth curled into a thin, cruel smile, and for a moment Samuel thought he could hear it laughing, a soft, hollow sound that sent chills down his spine. Echo's growl grew louder, a low guttural warning that filled the room. The dog was bristling his tail, stiff, every muscle in his body taut with tension. The figure didn't move. It just watched them. "What are you?" Samuel demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. He raised the rifle, pointing it toward the figure, but the gun felt heavy in his hands. Useless. The figure didn't flinch. It didn't react at all. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure spoke, its voice low and rasping as if it were coming from deep within the earth itself. "This place. It was never meant for you." Samuel's chest tightened, and he felt the weight of the figure's words sinking into his bones. The room seemed to close in around him, the air thick with something ancient and oppressive. He wanted to step forward to confront whatever this thing was, but his body refused to move. The figure's gaze was too strong, its presence too overwhelming. It was like staring into the face of something that had existed long before he had been born, something that had been waiting for him. "I don't care," Samuel spat, his voice raw with determination. "I'm not leaving until I know what happened here. What you've done." The figure's smile widened, if it was even possible. It tilted its head slightly, as if amused by Samuel's defiance. "You cannot undo what has been done," it said. "The past has already claimed you. You will never be free." Echo barked sharply, a sound full of fury, and Samuel felt the dog's presence at his side, a steadying force against the mounting terror. The dog had been with him through every battle, every impossible fight, and now more than ever he felt that bond, the bond between them that had survived everything the world had thrown at them. Echo Samuel whispered, his voice full of conviction. He took a step forward, his body shaking with the effort. "We're not here to be controlled by you. We're here to end this." With a sudden movement, the figure took a step forward, its presence filling the room. The shadows around it seemed to twist as if it were drawing the darkness into itself. The air grew colder, the temperature plummeting in an instant. Samuel's breath came in, sharp bursts, his fingers trembling on the rifle, and then without warning the figure lunged. Echo was faster. The dog moved with a speed that was almost blinding, leaping toward the figure, teeth bared. The figure swiped at the dog, but Echo dodged his powerful body, twisting in midair as he tore into the figure's form. The moment the dog's teeth sank into the shadowy figure, it let out a high-pitched screech that reverberated through the house, shaking the very foundation beneath them. The figure's form wavered, flickering like a candle in the wind. And for the first time, Samuel saw it for what it truly was, a hollow, broken shell of something that had once been human. A lost soul trapped in the house, condemned to haunt it for eternity. With one final growl, Echo tore into the figure, and it dissolved in a cloud of dust and smoke, vanishing into the air as if it had never been there at all. For a moment there was only silence. The oppressive weight that had filled the house seemed to lift, and the air grew warmer. Echo stood in the middle of the room, panting heavily, his body still coiled with tension. Samuel's heart was racing, but the fear had faded, replaced by a sense of relief, the kind of relief he hadn't felt in years. He looked around the room, his eyes falling on the desk in the corner. Something on it caught his attention, a small tattered journal, its pages yellowed with age. He moved toward it slowly, his hands still shaking, and picked it up. Opening it, he began to read the faded words. It was the journal of a man who had lived in this house long ago, a man whose life had been consumed by guilt and despair. His name was Samuel, too. The very same name that had haunted the veteran's thoughts ever since he had set foot in this place. The journal told a story of a man driven by dark desires who had come to this house seeking something redemption, perhaps, or an escape from his own demons. But in the end, he had found only darkness. And in that darkness, he had become the very thing he had feared. Samuel closed the journal, his hands trembling as he set it back down. The past had come for him, but now it was gone. As he turned to leave Echo at his side, Samuel finally understood. The house, the figure, the memories, they had been waiting for him to confront them, to face them. And now they were behind him. The door creaked open as they stepped outside, the cool night air washing over them. For the first time since he had arrived, Samuel felt the weight lift from his shoulders. The past had no hold on him anymore. The house was no longer his prison. Echo wagged his tail as if to say, "We did it." And in that moment, Samuel realized something he hadn't known before. He didn't need to escape his past. He just needed to stop running from it. The cool night air brushed against Samuel's skin as he stepped outside the house, his boots crunching against the dry earth. The wind had settled, and the oppressive weight that had clung to him inside the house seemed to lift, replaced by a strange, quiet calm. The moon hung low in the sky, casting soft light over the landscape, and for the first time in days the silence felt peaceful. The house, that dark, oppressive place, stood behind him now, just a shadow in the distance. Echo walked beside him, his body relaxed, his tail wagging slightly as he trotted along. The dog's usual alertness had softened, replaced by a calmness that mirrored Samuel's own. It was as though they had both found what they had been searching for, even if they hadn't known what that was until now. There would be no more running, no more hiding. The past had been faced, and the haunting presence that had loomed over them had been released. Samuel took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs each inhale, grounding him in the present, in the reality that he was finally free. Not just from the house, but from the chains of his own mind. He had spent so many years running from the things he couldn't change, from the guilt and pain that had followed him from the war. But in that house facing the shadows, he had found something he hadn't expected: redemption. Not through anything grand or heroic, but simply by confronting the truth, by accepting that the past had shaped him, but it didn't define him. It was a part of him, but it didn't have to be his future. As they walked away from the house, Samuel couldn't help but glance back once more. The figure, the shadow that had haunted him and Echo, was gone, but the house still stood. It had been a place of torment, yes, but now it felt different. It was just a house. The memories of what had happened there would always linger, but they no longer had a hold on him. He had faced the darkness within those walls, and now it was time to move forward. Echo stopped beside him, nudging his hand with his nose, looking up at him with those familiar, trusting eyes. Samuel bent down, resting a hand on the dog's head. The bond between them had always been unspoken but profound. Echo had been there for him through every battle, every dark moment, and now, in this moment of peace, Samuel realized just how much the dog had carried him. He wasn't alone. They never were. The dog had been his anchor, his reminder that even in the darkest times there was still light, still love, still loyalty, still hope. "You did it, boy," Samuel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We did it." The dog wagged his tail again, then turned and walked beside him, their steps in sync. They didn't need to say anything more. The weight of the past was finally behind them, and ahead of them lay the future, uncertain, yes, but full of possibility. The road stretched out before them, winding through the quiet landscape, but it felt different now. It felt like a path they could walk together, not as survivors of a past they couldn't change, but as two beings who had faced the worst and come out the other side stronger. Samuel didn't know where they would go next. He didn't need to. All that mattered was that he was no longer running, no longer hiding. He had made peace with his past, with the ghosts of the war, and with the house that had tried to trap him. And as they walked into the night side by side, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Echo paused for a moment, glancing up at him, then looked ahead toward the horizon. The dog's gaze held a quiet certainty, as if he knew something. Samuel was only just beginning to realize that the road ahead might be long, but it was theirs to walk. And in that moment, Samuel realized that redemption wasn't something that could be earned through actions or penance. It was something that came when you were finally able to accept yourself, all the parts of you, the broken and the healed, the dark and the light. It was when you could stop running and start living again. They didn't need to look back. They had both found what they needed in each other, and in the journey they had shared. The road ahead was open, and for the first time in a long time, Samuel felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. Together they could face anything, and maybe, just maybe, they could find a little peace along the way.